Hello, friends. Welcome to Storycraft. On this channel, you will enjoy world top stories. Let's view the video. The real story of Iron Brigade Born in Fire. The origins of the Iron Brigade. A nation on the brink. In the spring of 1861, the United States trembled. The southern states had seceded, and war loomed over the land. As President Lincoln called for volunteers to defend the Union, men from the Midwest responded with fierce determination. Wisconsin, Indiana, and Michigan, far from the battlefields, produced warriors unlike any others. These were not career soldiers. They were farmers, lumberjacks, factory workers. But they came armed with something even more powerful than rifles: unbreakable resolve. Forged in the western frontier. From the wild woods and rolling plains of the American Midwest, the first members of what would become the Iron Brigade stepped forward. They had never seen war, but they understood hardship. Bitter winters, relentless labor, and frontier justice had already hardened them. When the call to arms echoed, they didn't hesitate. Regiments like the 2nd, 6th, and 7th Wisconsin, the 19th Indiana, and later the 24th Michigan would eventually form a brotherhood that would make history. The Black Hat Brotherhood. Unlike other Union soldiers, these men adopted a distinct look: tall black hardy hats, a symbol of pride and defiance. While others wore blue kepis, the black hats made them instantly recognizable. But this wasn't about fashion. It was about identity. These men weren't just another regiment. They were something else entirely. They drilled harder, marched faster, and refused to back down. Even their officers noticed something different. The brigade developed a swagger, and soon, a reputation. Brawner's farm, baptism by blood. Their first true test came at Brawner's farm in August 1862. Outnumbered and outgunned, the Iron Brigade stood their ground against Stonewall Jackson's veteran troops. Muskets roared, smoke choked the fields, and men fell by the dozens. But the brigade did not break. They held their line for hours, trading shot for shot in brutal close-range combat. By the end, the field was soaked in blood, but the Iron Brigade had done the impossible. They had stopped Jackson cold. They had proven themselves in fire. The name that echoed. After Brawner's farm, generals and soldiers alike began to speak of them in awe. General McClellan himself gave them the name that would become legendary: the Iron Brigade. Not because they were made of steel, but because their will was unbreakable. They had faced death and did not flinch. They had earned a place in history, not through numbers, but through sheer, unmatched courage. A storm is coming. The men of the Iron Brigade didn't fight for glory. They fought for each other. And though their legend began in the smoke and fire of battle, it was only the beginning. Greater challenges lay ahead. Bloodier fields waited. The storm of Gettysburg was on the horizon, and the Iron Brigade would once again be called to stand when others would fall. The Black Hats march to war. A march unlike any other. As the sun rose over the eastern states, trains and steamboats delivered the men of the Iron Brigade to the E-by front, their destination, the Army of the Potomac. But something about these soldiers made them stand out. Their tall, black, hardy hats caught the light. Their uniforms were sharper, their movements more disciplined. Wherever they marched, people turned to look. They weren't yet famous, but they were already different. Eastern eyes, Western pride. Eastern soldiers smirked when they saw them coming. Western bumpkins, they said. What do these farmers know about war? But the men of the Iron Brigade didn't flinch. They had something to prove. The East may have been where the war started, but the Midwest was where true grit lived. And these black-hatted men were ready to show it. Every step they took was powered by pride, and every mile brought them closer to destiny. Tougher than the rest. In camp, their discipline was unmatched. Their drills were harder, their punishments harsher, and their expectations higher. Officers barked orders, and the men obeyed without hesitation. They didn't want comfort. They wanted victory. They trained in rain, mud, and blistering heat. While others rested, they trained. While others doubted, they prepared. A quiet fire burned in each soldier's chest. The war was not just about saving the Union. It was about proving that Western men were second to none. The look of legends. Those hardy hats were more than tradition. They became symbols. Worn tall and proud, they set the brigade apart. Soon, other Union troops began to whisper about those black hats. They stood straighter. They shot straighter. They fought harder. The Iron Brigade was becoming something rare, a unit known and feared before even firing a shot in a major battle. Rumors followed them, and anticipation grew. When the Iron Brigade marched through a town, the people stopped to watch in silence. First, shots, lasting impressions. Skirmishes began to erupt across the Eastern Front. At South Mountain, the Iron Brigade saw action again, and again, they did not falter. With bayonets fixed and eyes locked forward, they charged uphill into withering fire. The Black Hats didn't blink. They smashed through Confederate lines like thunder. Their fearlessness shocked even their own generals. And after the smoke cleared, the enemy knew one thing. These men were no ordinary troops. Earning the fear, Confederate soldiers began referring to them as those damn Black Hats. The name stuck. They had earned the fear of their enemies and the respect of their allies. With each battle, their legend grew. But so did the cost. Casualties mounted, brothers in arms fell. Yet still, the Iron Brigade marched on, grim and relentless. They weren't just fighting for the Union anymore. They were fighting to live up to the myth they were becoming. Toward the furnace of war. The road ahead led to the bloodiest fields of the war. With every step, the Iron Brigade drew closer to its ultimate test, Gettysburg. The fate of the nation would hang in the balance, and the Black Hats would once again be called to stand in the fire. Baptism at Brawner's farm. The calm before the carnage. August 28, 1862. The air was thick and still near Groveton, Virginia. The Iron Brigade, unaware of the storm awaiting them, marched into a quiet farmstead known as Brawner's farm. Birds chirped. Trees stood silently. But in the nearby woods, Confederate troops under the command of Stonewall Jackson lay in wait, hidden like wolves behind the tree line. What was supposed to be a routine movement would soon become a brutal showdown, one that would define the Iron Brigade forever. Clash with the stone wall. Without warning, musket fire shattered the silence. Confederate bullets tore through the trees and into Union lines. The Iron Brigade didn't panic. They formed ranks, loaded muskets, and returned fire with thunderous volleys. This wasn't maneuver warfare. It was face-to-face brutality at less than 150 yards. The men of the 2nd and 7th Wisconsin, alongside the 19th Indiana, dug in behind fence rails and hay bales. There was no retreat. There was only fire and fury. Steel. Nerves and steady hands. For over 2 hours, both sides stood their ground and unleashed everything they had. The Iron Brigade fired so rapidly that barrels overheated and hands blistered. Blood splashed the soil. The air grew thick with smoke and screams, but still they held. Confederate forces, shocked by the relentless defense, pushed harder. But every charge met with a wall of Black Hats and flashing steel. It wasn't just a fight, it was a test of will, and the Iron Brigade refused to break. The cost of immortality. By nightfall, the fields of Brawner's farm were littered with the dead and dying. Nearly a third of the Iron Brigade had fallen. Some regiments lost over 30% of their men. Friends bled beside friends. Brothers died with hands still gripping rifles. But even as darkness fell, the line had held. Against Jackson's veterans, the Black Hats had not only survived, they had stood toe-to-toe with one of the Confederacy's fiercest divisions and refused to yield an inch. A reputation, carved in blood news of the stand at Brawner's farm, spread like wildfire. Union generals couldn't believe it. Stonewall Jackson himself admitted the resistance was unlike anything he had faced. The Iron Brigade had gone from unknowns to legends in one night. They were no longer just soldiers. They were a symbol of courage, a brigade that wouldn't break, a wall of flesh and steel that death itself couldn't move. The faces behind the fire. Among the fallen were men barely out of boyhood, and others hardened by decades of frontier life. Their names may not fill textbooks, but their legacy was seared into history. Men like Colonel Lucius Fairchild of the 2nd Wisconsin, who led with bravery that inspired an entire regiment. Or the unnamed private who, with 3 wounds, still managed to reload and fire until his hands gave out. They were not just warriors, they were the soul of the Iron Brigade. A new kind of soldier. After Brawner's farm, the Iron Brigade was no longer questioned, no longer underestimated. Their tall black hats became feared symbols across both armies. But with glory came a price. Every future battle would demand more blood. The name Iron Brigade was now etched in history, but it had been bought with pain, sacrifice, and the lives of brothers, and the war was far from over. Hell at Gettysburg, holding the line. A blood-red dawn, July 1st, 1863, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. As morning mist clung to the hills, the Iron Brigade marched once more into the unknown. The sun hadn't yet burned. Through the fog, when scouts returned with news, Confederates were approaching fast. Without hesitation, the Black Hats were ordered forward. They weren't just the first line of defense. They were the last hope of stopping a flood. What awaited them was not a skirmish, it was hell. The charge into chaos. On McPherson's Ridge, the Iron Brigade clashed with General Heth's Confederate division. Outnumbered but not outwilled, they stormed into the woods, bayonets glinting, rifles blazing. The 2nd Wisconsin led the charge, slamming into enemy lines like a hammer against glass. Trees splintered, men screamed. The forest became a slaughterhouse. But the Iron Brigade didn't stop. They pushed deeper, breaking enemy formations and forcing Heth's men to fall back in confusion. The price of valor victory came with a terrible cost. Within minutes, the 2nd Wisconsin lost over 75% of its men. Colonel Lucius Fairchild was shot through the arm, his sword hand destroyed. He refused to leave the field until carried away by force. The 24th Michigan, in its first major battle, with the brigade, suffered over 80% casualties. But still, the line held. Still, the Black Hats refused to run. Each man who fell bought another moment for the Union line to form behind them. The day the Black Hats bled. As waves of Confederate infantry surged across the fields, the Iron Brigade became a wall of gunfire. Cartridge boxes emptied, rifles became clubs, blood ran down their faces, mixed with sweat and gunpowder. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, knowing the next volley could be their last. And still, they stood. What others called suicide, the Iron Brigade called duty. Their stand gave Union forces time to fortify Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill, positions that would become the anchors of the entire Union defense. When legends become flesh. Union commanders watched in awe. The Iron Brigade was no longer just a name. It was a force of nature, Officers spoke of their bravery with reverence. Confederate prisoners said they feared the men in black hats more than any others. At Gettysburg, the brigade lost over 100 of the 1,800 men who entered the battle. But they had held the line. They had turned the tide, and they had become immortal. Scars that would never heal. After Gettysburg, the Iron Brigade would never be the same. Its core had been shattered, regiments decimated, heroes buried beneath Pennsylvania soil. The survivors carried the weight of the fallen with every step they took. The black hats grew fewer, but their legend grew larger. They had stared into the mouth of death and did not blink. They had bought time, saved an army, and changed the course of a war. The echoes of McPherson's Ridge Long. After the guns went silent, the story of the Iron Brigade at Gettysburg echoed across campfires and history books. They were not the biggest army. They were not the best equipped, but they had something rare, unyielding courage. In a war filled with horror, their stand at Gettysburg was one of the brightest lights. A moment when ordinary men became eternal legends. The legacy forged in fire. A brigade of ghosts. After Gettysburg, the Iron Brigade was a shadow of its former self. Regiments that once marched 1,000 strong were now reduced to a few hundred battered souls. But those who remained carried something greater than numbers. They carried the weight of legend. Wherever they went, soldiers and civilians alike whispered their name. The black hats had become myth. More than just a name. They fought on through the wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Petersburg. Though fresh recruits joined, the original fire forged at Brawner's farm and Gettysburg was never quite the same. Yet every new soldier who wore the hardy hat understood. He was stepping into the boots of giants. The Iron Brigade wasn't a unit. It was an identity, an unspoken promise to fight harder, stand longer, and never retreat. Honored by friend and foe. Even Confederate generals admitted respect. Southern diaries spoke of dread at seeing the tall black hats appear on the horizon. Union leaders called them the bravest men they ever commanded. In Washington, President Lincoln himself took notice of their sacrifice. The Iron Brigade became a symbol of the best the Union could offer. Ordinary men made extraordinary through courage. The march into memory. By the war's end, only fragments of the original brigade remained. Yet their legacy outlived every battlefield. Monuments were raised, songs were sung, stories passed from one generation to the next. The black hats may have faded from the fields of war, but in the heart of American history, they still stand tall, forever iron. Thanks for watching. Subscribe our channel Storycraft for more interesting videos.